Good evening, and welcome to our Driven to Abstraction panel discussion associated with our virtual exhibition, Art and Authenticity in the Age of Fake News. Coming to you from the American University Museum at the Katzen Art Center in Washington, D.C. This program is a part of our Contested Space series of exhibitions designed to address issues relevant to the presidential election, which is, thankfully, over. We also dedicated the museum over to this purpose in 2008, 2012, and 2016. But due to the requirements of fighting the COVID-19 pandemic, all of the present exhibitions and programs were forced to move online, but we are still here. To see all our Contested Space exhibitions and programs online, I direct you to our Museum at Home series. The link is in the chat. We hope you will participate in today's discussion. Please add your questions and comments to the question box. We will field as many questions as we can at the end of the talk. We're so fortunate to have Nika Elder with us today. Elder is a curator as well as an assistant professor of American art at American University. She organized Art and Authenticity in the Age of Fake News with her students in the spring of 2020 graduate seminar on American art and the illusion of truth. And now she has put together this most excellent panel. Elder's research and teaching focus on the relationship between art and politics from the 18th century to the present, with a special focus on race and ethnicity. She's widely published, and her research has been supported by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the American Antiquarian Society, and the Terra Foundation for American Art. Please welcome Nika Elder.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Jack, and thank you all for joining us this evening. I think one of the very few benefits of not being able to convene in the actual museum space is you can have your preferred beverages with you. So please do partake and settle in for, I think, what promises to be a really interesting discussion. So I will introduce our speakers in just a couple of minutes. Before we get going, I wanted to offer a little bit of context for this panel and explain how it relates to the exhibition. So as Jack mentioned, Art and Authenticity in the Age of Fake News is a product of a graduate seminar that I taught in spring 2020. And it brings together around 20-25 works from the museum's collection, all of which push the boundaries of truth in art in a variety of different ways. So Sarah, if you could advance to the next slide. There are a number of works in the show that we would classify as portraits, but which deviate in different ways from exact verisimilitude or from the idea of physical likeness. Sarah, if you could advance again to the next slide, thank you. There are also a number of works that reimagine historical works of art, be they paintings or photographs, or tap into broader painting traditions. And then next slide, please. And then there are a small group of works that toy with the idea of authorship as we traditionally understand it. Normally, we think about one artist alone in their studio producing a work of art. And these are two of the works in the show that challenge that conception of artistry. So the Corot landscape on the left, for example, very likely involved the artist's students as well. He very commonly had his students work on his paintings, and a number of them have a questionable attribution, meaning there has been so much student work on them that it's unclear whether Corot himself should be credited as the artist. This is not one of those. This is definitely credited to Corot, but we can talk about the significance of that as the panel proceeds. The Dürer work is a bit of a different situation. Dürer himself etched the plate that the print was made from, but he did not actually produce this print himself. It was made posthumously after he died. So here too, a number of different hands were involved in the production of this work. That said, neither of these examples speaks to any particular attempt to deceive. These were all common practices at the times that Corot and Dürer partook of them. But what the panel looks at today is actual art fraud instances, or a particular instance where there was a real attempt to deceive viewers, and in fact, more specifically, collectors. And this gets at the term authenticity that's in the title of the exhibition. I had originally wondered whether or not to use that term in the title, because when you use the word authenticity in an art context, it immediately calls to mind the idea of fakes and forgeries. And the exhibition tends to take a much more generous view of the term and think about authenticity in a real conceptual way. But this panel tonight is a way for us to return to the real kind of intent of the term and think about authenticity in a technical way. So our focus, of course, is the documentary Driven to Abstraction, released in 2020 and produced and directed by Daria Price. As you know, it addresses the famed Knoedler case, specifically Desolé versus Knoedler. In 2004, the Desolés bought Mark Rothko from Knoedler for $8.3 million. In 2011, they sued Anne Friedman, Knoedler, and 831 Holdings, which is the parent company for the Knoedler Gallery, for fraud and racketeering. And in 2016, that case settled. So those are the very basic facts of the case, but as you likely saw in watching the film, the case and the film itself raise many more questions. So we're joined today by several panelists to help us think through those, and I am delighted to introduce them to you. So first off, we have Christine Haight Farley. Farley is a professor of law at American University Washington College of Law, where she teaches courses on intellectual property, advertising law, and art law. Her main areas of research are international trademark law, design protection, and art law. She serves as faculty director of the program on information justice and intellectual property, and previously served as associate dean for faculty and academic affairs. She has been a visiting professor at the University of Paris West, the University of Puerto Rico, the University of Havana, Monash University, and the National Law University in Lucknow, India. She serves on the board of directors for the Center for Inter-American Legal Education and has been a Fulbright specialist for intellectual property law. And as she mentioned to us when we convened last week, she has her BA in art history too. So multiple different muscles can be flexed this evening. We're also joined by Dr. Victoria Sears Goldman. Goldman is a director in K2 Intelligence's Investigations and Disputes practice and is the primary researcher in its art risk advisory subpractice. She specializes in provenance research, art historical research, and art-related litigation support, as well as threat analysis, social media and attribution investigations, and due diligence research. Prior to joining K2 Intelligence, Victoria was the provenance researcher at the Cleveland Museum of Art, where she researched the provenance of paintings and sculptures in the museum's permanent collection. Victoria has also conducted both general and World War II era provenance research for a number of law firms and served as an expert witness for the plaintiff in the high-profile fraud case Desolé versus Knoedler Gallery, and you may recognize her, in fact, from the film itself. She's also done provenance research for private collectors, galleries, the Commission for Art Recovery, the International Foundation for Art Research, or IFAR, the Commission for Looted Art in Europe, and the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany. Finally, we are also lucky to have with us Lena Jayaswal. Lena is a documentary filmmaker and award-winning photographer with deep expertise and interest in issues of race, representation, and identity. Jayaswal's photographs are in the collections of the Center for Photography, Onfoco, Lightwork, Photo Center Northwest, and the Asian American Art Center. Her films have been broadcast throughout the country on PBS affiliates and through New Day Films. She was awarded the prestigious Gracie Allen Award from American Women in Radio and Television, and her work has been featured in critical film festivals as well as newspapers for the Indian diaspora. Jayaswal is a professor in the Film and Media Arts Division at American University. She is also the director of the photography degree and is currently interim associate dean for faculty affairs in the School of Communication. She was also the School of Communication's first inclusion officer. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Before we get started, another invitation to everyone who's watching this evening, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat. I have a couple of questions to get the ball rolling, but this event was really organized with the idea of answering audience questions in mind. So rest assured that no question is too large or too small. So let's jump right in. Let's start with Victoria. So at the heart of this lawsuit and case is the fact that 40-ish paintings that Anne Friedman and Knoedler procured from Glafira Rosales lacked a conventional provenance. Can you tell us a bit about what provenance is, what it normally looks like, and how it is compiled? And I think we would all enjoy hearing kind of your thoughts on, how you think that Anne Friedman and Knoedler were able to get away with not having a traditional provenance for these works for so long.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to join this panel. I'm very happy to be here. Just a little bit of background on provenance research. Provenance is in essence ownership history of a work of art or another object. And typically it comprises not just past owners, but also, any transfers that happened, whether it was consigned to an auction house, a dealer held it for a period of time. So really what you're aiming for is ideally a complete unbroken chain of ownership from creator to the present owner. That's fairly uncommon. It can be pretty difficult to establish a chain of ownership all the way back to creation, especially for obviously the older a work of art is, the harder it is to complete that chain. But we do our best. And at the heart of provenance is documentation supporting documentary evidence. And that can be anything. That can be museum records, bills of sale, auction catalogs, archival materials, wills, exhibition catalogs. So there's a whole range of primary sources that we're looking for when we're trying to establish provenance. And some sources that you might think would, be legitimate sources for provenance aren't. For example, a catalog raisonné. Anytime you're constructing a provenance, you're going to want to double check everything that you're looking at that, that isn't, very clearly a primary source. A number of times I've looked at a provenance in a catalog raisonné, gone through, tried to verify everything to find out that something was just blatantly incorrect, or maybe, and I can think of a few examples of this, where different works of art were just confused and their provenances were kind of conflated. There's one painting I researched where half the provenance was correct and the other half was another painting by the same artist. So basically, what's key is supporting documentary evidence. And normally when writing up a provenance, you include all sorts of notations to quantify what you're saying. Not only do you want to provide sourcing for an owner or an agent that you're including, but if there's something that we don't know, you want to be upfront about it, and you want to add in a question mark or a possibly or a probably, and then explain why. And of course, that's where Knoedler, where they got themselves into trouble. As part of my research that I did as an expert witness, I was supposed to research the provenances of these paintings, of approximately 40 paintings that were sold by Rosales to Knoedler. Obviously, I didn't find anything. There was no paper trail for these paintings. How could there be? Shortly after I did my research and submitted my expert witness report was when Rosales admitted that these were all fakes. So of course I didn't find anything. But what Knoedler did, or Friedman, or Rosales, or somebody did, was suggest a certain provenance for these paintings, because this David Herbert individual was sort of there in the right place at the right time, and he wasn't around anymore. And so, obviously I can't speak to their thought process, but it's like, okay, well, we'll put him in there. Now, if I were doing a provenance and I was researching some paintings and I found that there was some indication that, David Herbert had maybe been involved in the sale of these paintings, what you might do is kind of footnote your provenance and say, David Herbert was, involved with these artists and he sold these types of paintings. And while he, could theoretically have been involved, there's nothing to indicate that he was actually involved in the sale of these paintings. But as we know, Knoedler put that provenance forth as fact, basically. You can't do that. I mean, there was no supporting evidence for that whatsoever. As far as how were they able to get away with not having a conventional provenance, well, they presented it as if it were a conventional provenance. And, initially nobody looked further because it seemed possible. Herbert was somebody who dealt with these artists at that time period. So it looked like a conventional, legitimate provenance, but it really wasn't. And I think that what people kind of glossed over because they were so kind of, I don't know if starstruck is the right word, but with this cache of all these paintings by these masters, is that they overlooked the fact that, wait a minute, these are really prominent artists we're dealing with, and all of a sudden we have about 40 paintings that nobody's ever heard of before. I mean, just logically, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, one or two, unknown paintings by, great artists is one thing, or a bunch of paintings by an artist nobody's ever heard of. But it just didn't make any sense. But people, whether, willingly or sort of subconsciously chose to look past that.
Well, a follow-up question, I think something interesting that you bring up is this idea that it's uncommon to have a clean, stable provenance, because the film suggests that this Knoedler case was almost like anomalous, that it tapped into lots of red flags and pitfalls and problems within the art world, but that it was this extreme case. But what you're saying suggests that it's actually kind of normal for a provenance, or common, maybe more common than we would think or hope, for a provenance to be somewhat problematic or to have gaps or holes. And might that also be one of the reasons why people would have been a little bit, or inclined to be a little bit forgiving of some of the ambiguities around this?
Yeah, I mean, in my experience at least, there's usually something. I mean, usually you have something in the provenance, but this was a case where they were brought to her with, in essence, nothing. I mean, if somebody brought a painting to me and said it was sold, you know, they got it from Mr. X, I mean, that's nothing. What is that? So while it's, you know, common enough to have incomplete provenances gaps, I mean, we all know the whole issue of World War II era gaps. I mean, you see that, you know, quite frequently. But to have nothing for paintings by Rothko, it would be very unusual.
All right, thank you. Christine, I have many questions for you about the legal aspects of this case, but I'll start with just one. And it's about kind of the differences between a civil case and a criminal case, because it sounds like this Nodler situation encompassed both. So the DeSolis brought the charges that the DeSolis brought against Anne Friedman, Nodler, and 831 were fraud and racketeering. And then it was the US government that charged Glafira Rosales with conspiracy to sell fake works of art, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and other fraud and tax-related crimes. So can you maybe explain to us, you know, what the different stakes are of those types of cases?
Sure. Let me just first say thanks so much for inviting me. This is so fun. I loved watching the film and really relished the opportunity to speak with this group about this really interesting case and hear questions from the audience. So I think, you know, people outside law know what the criminal standard is. You know, beyond a reasonable doubt is a really high threshold in criminal cases. When the buyers brought claims against these defendants, and there were a number of cases brought against these defendants, these cases were brought in civil court, right, in civil actions. And there are a couple of standards of evidence which are much lower. One is a preponderance of evidence, which is, you know, kind of more likely than not, or clear and convincing evidence, which is that the facts show something which is highly probable. But even still, each of the claims that was brought against these parties, and especially the claims that really went to Anne Friedman's actions, each of them had some element of knowledge or intent. So as part of the fraud claims, for instance, the plaintiffs had to prove by clear and convincing evidence that Anne Friedman knew that she was selling a fake painting to these buyers, that she had an intent to deceive them, an intent to misrepresent them, and short of actual knowledge, that under the law, that can be proved by showing that somebody was really acting recklessly, right? That there were obvious signs that they were ignoring, right? And I think that that standard really captures much better what at least we saw from the movie and what I read in these cases in terms of what was going on, right? That, it doesn't seem like there was ever any evidence that was produced in any of these cases or discussed in the movie that showed that Anne Friedman definitely knew that these were fakes, right? She met the artist in Queens, or, Rosales confessed to her, right? There was never any evidence like that, but there were so many red flags. There were so many strange things that probably should have been really clear warning signs to her, and maybe she acted recklessly with regard to those signs. And then there were pieces of evidence that were really just disturbing, right? So there was evidence that the Diebenkorn family really raised some very serious questions about a few of the Rosales paintings. And apparently the artist Diebenkorn had been kind of unusual in keeping very detailed records, and there were no records of these paintings. There was, in 2003, there was an IFAR report that showed that one of the Pollocks had kind of problematic evidence. The pigments that were used weren't available then. There was some other kind of forensic evidence that was a big question mark. So there were a number of things that kind of were staring Anne Friedman in the face, and maybe that would rise to the level of this knowledge standard. Now, none of these cases were tried on the merits, and there was never an actual trial. There were decisions along the way, but the major decision on the merits that was reached in each one of these cases was the defendant's motion for summary judgment. So what that means is the defendants asked the court to dismiss the case before the trial, saying that or not before the trial, sorry, but based on the evidence that was produced that showed that if you take the facts as they are, the plaintiffs cannot meet their burden. They cannot demonstrate some of these elements of knowledge. And the court went through each of the claims, because there were many claims in the cases. They went through each of them very carefully and found that, under the standard for summary judgment, that really these were questions that needed to go to the jury, so that the court shouldn't dismiss the case before the jury actually got to decide it, that these were fact-based questions. Do you believe her that she didn't know anything about it or not? And that was like a very good kind of question for the jury. And based on the evidence that was produced, you could imagine a jury might find that there was enough knowledge. So by and large, the claims were not dismissed against defendants. And for, most cases don't fully play out in court. And it's, I know in the documentary, some of the people who were interviewed said it was so disappointing that we didn't get to the conclusion in the case, and we'll never know. But what generally happens is when you have a decision like that, where the court says there's enough evidence here that a jury could find the defendant's guilty, that's when the defendant wants to settle. So it wasn't surprising after those decisions that there were settlements.
That is really fascinating. I guess I wonder, then, if based on your experience, do you think that this case will occasion new kinds of laws concerning the regulation of the art market? Or how do you go from a case like this, and I think an outsider's view of it is this going to be the pivot point where things change, or is it the case that the law worked as it should in this case, and it's just that they broke it, but that things were stringent enough, they got caught, and that there was legal recourse?
Yeah. I don't see this case. I mean, perhaps the case developed some of the questions in the law for future cases, I think the judge did a very careful job going through the evidence. I mean, the decisions were very long and they were numerous. And it was the same judge in each case. So I kind of felt like the judge was devoting years of his life to this story. So, on those questions of knowledge, perhaps the law developed a little bit in a way that would help in future cases. But I think that, there was nothing in the case that was like, no way can we accept this. We've got to go back to the legislature and, have the law reformed or create new standards or anything like that. In fact, part of what the judge was working through was one element of one of the claims was it reasonable for the buyers to rely on this, right? So when you look at this provenance, what we just heard from Victoria, there was nothing, right? There's nothing here. You're going to spend millions of dollars on a painting. And I remember in one of the cases of the Rothkos, the provenance simply said, purchased from artist from collection in Switzerland. That was it, nothing more, right? And, if a buyer is going to spend millions of dollars on that, was it reasonable to rely on the statement from Anne Friedman that wasn't in the provenance? And, none of these people just happened to walk off the street into the gallery and, were bamboozled by her. These were all, serious art buyers, had purchased art before. In particular, the Desoles. Desole himself was a lawyer. He was the CEO of Gucci. I think as the CEO of Gucci, he's probably given some thought to authenticity and fakes and things like that, He's since become the chairman of Sotheby's. So, he was a very sophisticated buyer. Was it reasonable for him to just rely on this or not to investigate the facts more himself? The court concluded it was reasonable that, if a reputable gallery couldn't come up with more facts on the paintings, then certainly a buyer wasn't going to be able to. But I think the law does properly put some onus on purchasers, that they can't just, believe everything they say and then turn around and sue when that seems really unreasonable to do.
Great, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Lena, I'm very fascinated to hear your opinion on kind of the documentary as a whole. In watching it, I kind of thought that the thesis boiled down to like one of the last statements that's made. The New York Times reporter, who's interviewed quite a bit in the film, says the art world lacks transparency, and that is clearly a point that the film is working towards throughout. And as a documentary filmmaker, like who do you think they foresaw as the audience for this film? Like who were they hoping would hear this message?
Sure. To me, I think, the art world lacks transparency. I think that they're addressing that to all of those in the art world. Every person who is either a creator or any part of the art world, I think that's who they're addressing it to. I think that this film is not made for a general audience, because you really need to know enough about the case. I think it assumes that you know the art world and you know the detail. I mean, we learned a lot about, just in this panel from Victoria, about provenance. And that wasn't really discussed in the beginning of the film. So I think as a general viewer walking in, there's just too much detail. And I think the film was really well researched, and maybe too well researched at some points where you kind of forgot to see the bigger picture. And we're just focusing on sort of the smaller details. And so those are things that I think that kind of came up to me when I was thinking about it as a filmmaker. From that perspective. But the idea of the art world lacks transparency, I think we can fill in anything, right? We can put the government lacks, the music industry, the education, higher education. I mean, we could go on and say that. But I don't think for the general population, we think about the fraudulence in art. Because we're in this world, we might think about it a lot more, but maybe not so much for the general population. And so I think that could be makes it for an interesting case for somebody who is on the outside to look in. what would be nice is from seeing this film is if the institutes that can make change, like the museums, like the Sotheby's and the Christie's, will actually start to look and make some changes from that. I read somewhere that Sotheby's and Christie's have a policy against repayment 5 years after a sale, even if the sale is found to be fake. And I don't know if that's still continuing, and maybe because DeSoto, I didn't know that, is now a chairperson at Sotheby's, maybe that's going to shift and change some of the ways that they practice, which would be interesting. But even in the movie, we hear this line that, to me, it was one of the more disturbing things, was that the museums decommission the work once they find out that they're fake, and then the painting gets sold or it gets sent to a smaller gallery, or it's still in the market. It's not removed from the market. It just continues to someone else who might be another poor sucker, along the way. And so to me, I'm hoping that this film will maybe look at those practices. One of the things I wish, and I know as a documentary filmmaker, you don't always get the access that you want, but to me, the more interesting story would have actually been to follow Anne Freeman or Glafira Rosales. I think them as characters, I felt in a lot of ways the film was aptly titled with Abstraction, because we were really hearing about them in the abstract, right? And by all of the experts, and it sort of felt like a visual game of telephone. You're just sort of feeling and hearing about these people, but not really ever hearing their voices, not even in news stories, right? Not even in like previous interviews or any of that. And so for me, I was missing that element, but I also understand that, that why they wouldn't go on record, like why wouldn't they go on camera to say all of these things? But to me, I would have again, going to the question of authenticity, I would have loved to hear their authentic voices coming through this documentary, because it would have given me a whole another feeling, about the film and seeing that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I read that there is going to be another documentary about this case coming out, and the trailer shows that filmmaker was able to talk to Anne Freedman, I believe also to Rosales's ex-boyfriend, but I think Rosales doesn't appear in that film, and neither does Pei Shen Chen either. Although apparently other people have been able to contact him for interviews, but it definitely seems like the two of them were in much more precarious positions as far as this case is concerned. So I could understand their reluctance to participate, even if they were asked, but who knows, I think, as you're saying, if they in fact were. So we have some questions coming in the chat here. Let me scroll back and see. So Margot asks, why did Glafira Rosales get such a modest punishment? Was that a surprise or expected? Is that in line with what a legal expert would expect? So Christine, maybe you could tackle this one.
I'm playing the role of legal expert, I suppose, huh?
Yeah.
So, I didn't look at the criminal case, and I don't, I only know what the viewers know from the documentary about why the judge was so lenient with her. But I guess she, and even other people interviewed in the film seemed to be very sympathetic to her. So I think the testimony that came out in the trial was very convincing that she really was under threat, that she wasn't free to act, the way she wanted to, but she was really being controlled by somebody else. So, I guess that combined with the little bit of time that she'd done explains the leniency. And I think it's hard to compare that case to any other. It seems, quite specific. She was the face of the operation, but she wasn't the whole operation. And the judge believed her story.
Yeah, I might not, I don't know. I would question the idea of leniency, because she was ordered to pay $81 million, back, and she spent 9 months house arrest, which seems lenient, and 3 years probation. But Anne Freeman is is working at another gallery, created her own gallery. So I just kind of question that balance a little bit about whether or not, who became, the sentence became much more lenient, I think, for the establishment than it was for Rosales.
Great, thank you both. Another question here, let's see. Geneva-based Switzerland's Fine Art Expert Institute's chief, Jan Walter, claims that estimates of 50% of art circulating on the market being forged or misattributed are likely on the conservative end of the spectrum. What does that say about what we aesthetically value in painting and sculpture when we can be so easily fooled? And I think there was a similar question to that one that came in advance that phrases it a little bit differently. So let me ask that one too. So that person was asking, what does it say about the art world's fetishized notions of authenticity if an unknown artist was able to produce works that even top art professionals enjoyed? So two big questions for sure.
I think one thing is that the art world it's largely dependent. I mean, it really thrives on opacity, and somebody had written in the comment that as long as the art world allows unknown buyers and sellers, that fraud will continue, and that, I mean, that's correct. I mean, there's so much money laundering that happens through art, and I think that just as, Anne Friedman, I mean, she claims that she was duped. But, if this can get past all these experts who supposedly gave, the paintings their blessings and said they looked good, as they say. I mean, of course, in hindsight, they say that, no, that doesn't mean that we were saying they were authentic. But if these can get past the experts, of course, they're going to get past your average, run-of-the-mill buyer. And so many art transactions are cloaked in mystery, and art world players want to keep it that way, that nobody's going to be able to get to the bottom of provenances or anything like that. And I think the cycle, I think it's just going to continue. Nika, I think you had asked before about, well, is anything going to change because of this case? I don't think so. I mean, people, like when I worked as, an independent provenance researcher and art consultant, I mean, we're always telling people, do your due diligence before you buy a work of art. I mean, I don't know if more people are doing that now or not. And I don't think, I think it's going to be pretty hard for any more regulation to need to be applied to the art world. I think that art world players are very resistant to change. And I think that, so many collectors and buyers depend on this anonymity and those are the people that are needed to kind of keep work circulating.
Yeah, and I also wonder too, like something that I see in both of these questions is this assumption maybe that these collectors are looking for works of art that they are going to enjoy or that they respond to in some visceral way. And I think that's probably true in some cases, some of the times. But I think when you are on the hunt for like a rare Rothko and a Rothko all of a sudden appears and you want it, maybe you like Rothko, but you're also looking at art not just as a source of enjoyment, but I think also as an investment. And I think that's one of the things that is that is not necessarily willing to go to whatever lengths for a painting they love, but that they are going to these lengths almost, in the hopes that that this gamble essentially is going to pay off, and it is going to be a Rothko. I think it's different for different collectors, but that's something we might also want to keep in mind.
You know, one of the things I wonder about, and I don't have enough information to really reach a conclusion, is about the buyers and the prices that they paid for these paintings, because certainly Anne Friedman was paying a rock bottom discount price, right? And that again was one of those warning signs. You know, it didn't seem like she paid over $1 million for any one of those paintings, and at least one of them she sold for 363% more than she paid for it, right? That was like a bad fact for the gallery, again, a warning sign about knowledge. But my guess is that the prices that she sold them at, because of these concerns that she probably harbored, were lower than the market value. And so I wonder, you know, just as you've said, whether the buyers were really buying them. The question talks about aesthetic value. So whether they were buying them for the aesthetic value, or as you say, the investment value, that, you know, this is a good price, I can display it here and there, I can lend it, you know, I can add to the provenance, and then I can sell it. And that, you know, and somebody else asked, you know, where are the other ones? Where are the other of the 40? Where are the others? And they're out there, and maybe that's what those buyers are thinking.
Yeah, to me, I think this also brings up the question of gatekeepers, and you know, the history of art in general, right? The fact that the Rothkos and the Rauschenbergs and, you know, all of these, the Pollocks, everybody, like the Patient was able to replicate multiple abstract artists, right, in ways that fooled so many. And to me, I think about that talent, and, you know, what about the ability for him to have succeeded in the art world, and who was stopping that, and who were the gatekeepers that were preventing that? And so that brings up the idea of class and race, and, you know, all of those kinds of things, to me, not on top of all of this other stuff, but because clearly he would have had what I think is more talent, because it's very hard to duplicate and replicate other artists. And in art school, that's one of the first things that we have to do, right? You know, we have to like kind of modify our own work to try and replicate another artist. And that's not an easy thing to do. And so to me, I think that's really a deeper question that I would have loved the film to have gotten into a little more. And I would say that this scandal is not just in paintings, but a few years back, I worked at a photo gallery for many years, and we were part of the Art Association's International Art Association Dealers Fair, and there was a big controversy in 1999 with Louis Hine, the photographer Louis Hine. He was a well-known early 20th century documentary photographer, really kind of pioneered social documentary. And he's known for making the photographs that inspired Upton Sinclair to write The Jungle, and, you know, really changed child labor laws. And there are a couple of his images that were quite famous. And when he died penniless, and he didn't really care about the way that the images looked. You know, he sort of printed them with scratches and dust and everything, because it was more about the idea and the content of the image rather than, like, you know, the value of the photograph. And Walter Rosenbloom and his wife Naomi Rosenbloom were really well-known photographer. Walter was a photographer himself. Naomi Rosenbloom wrote the book on history of photography. So these are, you know, sort of, again, the gatekeepers in the photo world. They had his estate they had his negatives and his prints for a short period of time before they donated it to the Eastman House. And during that time, it's now sort of coming out that he printed a couple of the more famous Louis Hine images as his own, and then authenticated them as being vintage. And vintage means printed at the same time that they were taken. And the art market, the photo market, has made those prints more valuable than, you know, something that would be reprinted now. And so these scandals will keep coming. You know, I think we're just waiting for the next big one, and we'll just see it in different ways.
Great, thank you all. Another, which I think probably came up for many folks watching the film, is how is it possible that Anne Friedman was able to open another gallery? How do you explain that people trusted her even after the trial? I would add to that too, what does that say about the art world?
I'm going to look to Victoria. I can't understand that. How it's possible.
I mean, I wish I had an answer. I don't get it. I don't know. I don't understand. Admittedly, I don't know how her gallery is doing, if she's had success there. But I'm sure that there is an element in the art world who has stood by her and looks at her as she does herself as a victim. People who could maybe see themselves being in her position as she continues to maintain her innocence. And I'm sure there's a number of people who have stood by her. And, going back to the ideas of class, and I think it may be easier for some people to see her, this, president of this well-established gallery as a victim and place the blame on Rosales and Jen. I think that might be easier for a lot of people in the art world to stomach.
And then, we haven't talked about Hammer, who kind of, I guess, seems to have inherited the Knoedler Gallery and had this holding company that siphoned off millions of dollars after the FBI started investigating the gallery. But, he got off, when Lena was talking about relatively leniently, and part of the embarrassing facts that swirled around him in the cases that I read was apparently he stated that he wasn't even familiar with the artists involved in the scandal. He didn't know who they were. He didn't know the names. I don't know how that's possible, but he was so clueless and checked out of the Knoedler Gallery that some of the claims against him were actually dismissed. Not everything, but some of them were dismissed because he was just so out of the loop.
Thank you. On the opposite end of the spectrum here, someone's asking about Pei Chen's paintings. It seems remarkable. Well, do we know for certain that he painted all of these paintings? It seems remarkable that he could copy all these different styles so successfully. And what does the art he himself makes or made look like? I have a couple of insights into that, but does anyone want to speak to Pei Chen's work? I did a little bit like as is possible, like the extent possible of a deep dive on him, and there you can find a really interesting interview with him that was conducted by ABC News, I think, and he continues to be a practicing artist in China. He was very adamant. I personally believe him that he didn't realize that these works were going to be sold for this amount of money. As he understood it, he was not making forgeries, he was making copies for people who couldn't afford the real thing. That sounds, in the context of the history of copying, and particularly in China, that sounds completely plausible. That has been a common practice there for centuries. So he was executing these works in all these different styles, but I think that really was part of his skill. His own work reads as kind of a pastiche of not just abstract expressionism, but like post-impressionism. It's like a combination of a lot of different things, but he apparently has had gallery shows in China and has shown his work there. So I think he ended up, my sense of it from what I've read is that he ended up being more successful as an artist in terms of showing his own work in China than he was in the United States. So let me check our Q&A box here. So are there standards and or ethical requirements among art dealers on provenance? For example, why are collectors allowed to be anonymous? Are their business records available for inspection? I think that may be a Victoria question.
Yeah, I mean, collectors have been always allowed to remain anonymous, and it's going to stay the same. You know, there are a number of galleries, you know, for instance, Knoedler's old records. I mean, they're all at the Getty, and you can look at them. I forget what date that goes up through. A lot of galleries do donate their records to various museums and archives. In terms of, you know, going to a gallery and saying, hey, I want to look at, you know, your records for a recent purchase or a recent sale. I don't know that they're going to let, you know, that they're going to want to make that public. I mean, if a dealer if a seller or a buyer wants to remain anonymous, at least in the short term, a gallery's not going to let somebody come in and see, you know, who the actual, you know, buyer or seller was. I mean, the gallery, otherwise nobody would trust these galleries to maintain their anonymity. So, you know, typically, you know, unless a gallery has donated their records, or perhaps it's a very large gallery that may have its own archive that, you know, you can make appointments to view, you know, they're not going to just let somebody come in and see the actual sales records that would disclose who that anonymous buyer or seller was.
Well, one last question, picking up on that one. Someone asks, what are the pathways and pitfalls to a more regulated art market? And I think, you know, what the film would say about that is it is this, you know, primacy that's placed on privacy and protectionism. But what is driving this, like the allowance for this level of privacy and this level of secrecy that extends not just from the galleries themselves, but to all affiliated institutions and parties? Because it is, you know, it's not just the galleries, like these works then ultimately may end up in museums. It is a broad, you know, network of entities that's involved.
I think Victoria probably has more to say on this than I do, but I guess I'll just say that, I mean, it's not surprising at all to me that there's so much privacy in this space when you think about whose privacy interests are being protected. You know, our discussions of privacy kind of take on new resonance every day, and all of us have all these incursions on our privacy. But the privacy that's really being protected here is, you know, people's estates, people's money, right? People's investments. And I think the other interest that's served by all of this lack of transparency is reputations. You know, I was just, as Victoria was talking about provenance and all the mistakes that, you know, she's found in her career. I mean, it becomes very, you know, when everything is, you know, out in the open for people to inspect, I think, you know, we'll see all of these fakes that are circulating and all of these mistakes in provenance. And, you know, it hurts people's careers. So I think the insiders don't see that they would benefit from more transparency.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add there would be no real benefit to it. They want to maintain their privacy, their investments, as Christine said. I mean, I don't know that there's that much more to it than that. I mean, it's just there's a lot of secrecy, a lot of opacity, and you know, I don't know that anybody would gain at this point by suddenly, disclosing all the names of buyers, and people want to protect themselves. And I just don't think there's any motivation to make things more transparent for the actual people involved in these transactions. And that's not a very satisfying answer, but
Yeah, I mean, even in the galleries, right? When I worked in the galleries, we wouldn't share our mailing lists for those same reasons. You've established a reputation with your clients, and they trust that you're not going around and sharing that information, and that they would come to you if they wanted to buy something or if they had to sell something. So I can't imagine that would work well for the dealers, at least.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to the other example you brought up of the Lewis Hines photographs, Lena, and how the documentary does this great job of showing how insane the facts of this specific case are, but they really dovetail with a lot of other cases too. And so you could see the entire market collapsing in a sense if one little thread is pulled here.
Yeah, and in that case in particular, it was actually a gallery owner who had sold the image to somebody that started the whole case opening, because they were trying to see, if they thought that this was a forgery, but the person who forged it was the expert. And so it goes back to the same thought of the gatekeepers of
Yeah.
well, how do you, that cycle just keeps fulfilling. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this came up a bit with the comments on Pei Shen, but it's really the artists who get lost in this whole mishigas here, that once the painting leaves their studio, it enters this entirely different universe where their name basically becomes a brand. On that very cheery note, I think we'll need to wrap up. Hopefully we have not burst all your illusions of art. You're still able to find enjoyment in it while taking a critical view of the worlds in which it operates. But I want to say a huge thank you to all of our panelists today. This was really wonderful, and I enjoyed hearing your thoughts on all of these wide-ranging topics, and I'm sure our audience did too. So thank you all so much. Thank you all for coming, and welcome back, Jack.
Thank you, Nika. Thank you, panelists. That was great. I'm really sorry it's ending, and I want you all to come back, and maybe we'll invite some art dealers and other people to contribute to the discussion. But it was fascinating. Thank you so much. I just want to remind you that you can go to our website and look at all the contested space exhibitions and programs we have online. Please visit Museum at Home. And I look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you all so much.